I'm Florante, and I recently retired from Loyola Law School as a librarian for um, 28 years. Well, I wasn't a librarian the whole time. But anyway, I have my master's in Asian American Studies and Information Studies in Library Science from UCLA in 2006. I got my undergraduate degree in Comparative Cultures from UC Irvine back a long time ago in '77. I was a co-founder of both UCLA Samahang Filipino and the UC Irvine Kababayan organizations when I was working at UCLA at Asian American Studies and when I was a student at UC Irvine back in '73, '74. I currently teach at Pasadena City College. I teach a class in the only class I'm teaching, which is History of Asian Pacific Americans. And if you're interested, please let me know. I think I can let people into the class as guests to go check it out. Um, and then there are a number of films that Jaime has on the website that you might want to be interested in to follow up with the discussions we're having. That's probably all I got to say, except for when we get started. Is it?
Yes, it's
Okay.
all yours.
All right. So this is about Pinoys, agency, and arts and culture. So first of all, I just wanted to ask a question. Are folks familiar with the term agency? And what is agency? To me, agency is having the the ability to do things, to change things. Agency is from my own um, initiative. So in this sense, we're talking about Pinoys having agency in the arts and culture, that they weren't just victims of things, that they also participated and made their own arts and their own culture. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So in the time of America's in the Heart, we're talking about a lot of violence in America. We're talking about a lot of racism. We're talking about a lot of sexism. We're talking about a lot of problems. And this is in the time of also a depression. So you have to understand that the country was kind of like in this pandemic, people were stuck and they were not doing well, and they were feeling a lot of psychological problems, mental anguish, and so forth. We have the Opis from the Dust Bowl moving to California at the same time because they had no farms again where they were, and the opportunities were always being advertised that go to California, we have jobs and we have a lot of open areas and so forth. This is also at the time of the rejection of the early Chinese pioneers that came here, and also the Japanese Americans with the Gentleman's Agreement. They formed the brunt of cheap labor for the agricultural businesses in Hawaii and also on the mainland, from Seattle all the way, well, actually all the way from the canneries in Alaska down to San Diego, and canneries and even San Pedro and in Terminal Island here locally. So let's get started. So this is a quote from E. San Juan Jr. From 1999. And E. San Juan Jr. is a scholar who's done a lot of research and is one of the instigators of getting Carlos Bulason's work out in the open again. You know, if you're not that familiar with Carlos Bulason's background, he was actually a poor, not even a student, but a poor worker, peasant, from the peasant class in the Philippines, came following his two brothers to the US to work and support his family in the Philippines. And in that time, he experienced many of the things that he saw, that he portrayed in America's in the Heart. And he always had in his mind that his work would be a way to try and change the conditions of how Americans viewed Filipinos and how Americans should see themselves in their own country with their own ideals. The same ideals that they were taught in the schools that were colonial schools in the Philippines after the Philippine-American War. This is about some of the stuff around. You can go ahead and just read that. So Laughter of My Father was translated into several languages, and later on he wrote America's in the Heart, and that was what the whole focus of our talks are and this book club. His dear friend Chris Monsalves, who is the character Jose in the book, wrote this in his obituary. I am willing to testify that Carlos Bulasan is dead, but he will never die in the hearts of the people. So it's very profound. And originally when Carlos was buried, there was no gravestone in the cemetery, and it wasn't until years later that folks from the Philippine American National Historical Society and the community put money together to find a gift from a gravestone so he could be marked. He wasn't the only one that was a writer that was recognized in his day. Jose Garcia Villa was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in 1943. So he's the gentleman back here that has the, vest open and the tie showing. So this is a grouping, says, of the Gotham Book Mart reception in 1945. Then Benvenido Santos was another writer of that time. He wrote a number of things. And so these are some of his works. One of my favorites is The Day the Dancers Came, which I use in my class. And it talks about the experiences of our Manongs after they've lived a life of working and are trying to settle down and reminisce about their lives in the Philippines and how things could have been if they had their own kids, their own grandkids. But as you know, a lot of the Filipino Manongs of that day were part of a bachelor society because of the anti-miscegenation laws that prevented them from marrying white women. But in some cases, they were still able to get away with it by going out of state. California didn't stop having anti-miscegenation laws until 1946. And the rest of them, I think the country, not until 65, when it became nationally okay to have anti-miscegenation. Now, the difference between Jose Villa and Benvenido Santos is that these two writers were well known, but they had a high educational background. They both went to colleges here in the United States, and were able to graduate. As opposed to Carlos, who is pretty much a self-taught reader and writer of English. And so that's what's so amazing about him, that he was able to develop his craft by emulating others that were also progressive writers of his day and also communicated with them. During that time, the U.S. had acquired the Philippines after the Philippine-American War and become an imperial power, much like they had envied those European powers that had colonies in India, in South America, and in Asia. So as a new possession of the U.S., the Philippines had an exhibit, or the Americans had an exhibit of a Philippine village at the St. Louis Fair in 1904. So this was to showcase how, this is ours, we won it, and now this is part of the U.S. So one of the things that became a controversial thing, but at the same time drew a large audience to the St. Louis Fair, was the must stop to see the Igorot Dog Feast. I think they did it once a week, and this is I think they were charging folks on the midway 25 cents to come in and check it out. And you know, the reality was that the Igorots were given the dogs to eat, but at the same time, to them, dogs were not an everyday meal. It was more of a delicacy that they had for special occasions. But, you know, this was a way to show, oh, look at how primitive these people are. They're eating dogs. At the same time, at that exhibit, they tried to show, because anthropology was a new science that was being developed, that in the Philippines, they could show the different stages of Philippine culture rising, or Western influence rising. So they also had um, uh, exhibit areas that showed Filipino weavers making cloth, and also showing how there's different levels of civilization of Filipinos, taking from uh, those who had come more from the Ilustrado class, those who were had were part of the merchant class, having some money, were able to show the finer things that they had been civilized to from the Spanish and then later the Americans. So one of the things that was very prominent also at the World's Fair was the Philippine Constabulary Band. And they became a showpiece of showing how civilized Filipinos had become under American rule. They were so well regarded that they were able to be the first, and I think only so far, marching band to lead the inaugural in, inauguration parade for President Taft at the time. So President Taft was a governor of the Philippines previously, and he loved this group. So he encouraged them, and they in turn also loved him. And he, the band leader of the Philippine Constabulary group was an African American, Walter Loving, who was instrumental in making them very professional. He had a formal education in music here in the United States, and encouraged them also to attend classes. And they were on tour throughout the US for different events and parades, and were very, very well known. In fact, there's a story that John Philip Sousa heard them play, and he thought they were one of the best bands he had ever heard. So, you know, John Philip Sousa, that's an endorsement. Music has always been a part of Filipino life. In this particular picture that was part of the collection from Uncle Roy Morales, Doroteo Ines, who's my grand uncle, is playing the trumpet. At least his daughter and son think that's him in the picture. He was in the picture. He was very for sure who he was, but he was also a leader and board president of the Filipino Christian Church in historic Filipino town when the church was first getting started. And he also went to USC and received a master's in cinematography for what is believed to be perhaps one of the first films made on Filipino Americans in America, and it was entitled A Filipino in America. There's a link here when we make this slideshow available that you can go to and look at it on YouTube. It is a black and white silent film that was redone, what do you call it, remastered, I guess, into VHS tape, and then later on into MP4, so it's on YouTube. So you can see it there. There was some you know how silent films have the captions, they don't really have dialogue because they're, you know, talking with a black and white silent film. They tried to add some music to it and so forth, and so it makes it a little more interesting. It is a half-hour run, but and some places are really burned out, but the film has preserved, and so this is what we have as probably our first Filipino American film. Now, in this picture, this is the cover of the book by Professor Linda Marum at Cal State Long Beach. You can see that these guys are pretty healthy. They're at the beach. The one in the middle is the dad of one of our close friends in the community, Gerald Batan's dad. And, huh? What? Oh, he's in the audience. Okay. So Gerald can recognize his dad. Anyway, so Pinoys were not emasculated Orientals. So if you remember or if you don't remember, during that time, Asian men were being feminized or looked down upon as being not uh, uh, as sexually attractive or engaging for women, that they were being put down, that Chinese laundrymen did women's kinds of things of cleaning, of doing the laundry, because they were forced into those occupations. And Filipinos, on the other hand, were seen as these young guys that were strong from working in the fields all day long, and also having, because of the way it was set up, Filipino men were not encouraged to bring women, wives or daughters to the U.S. because of uh, the labor needs. Did not want women. They did not want families. They just wanted men to work and expected them to go home when they're done. So that was the mindset of American labor at the time, of the agricultural industry and the Alaskan cannery industry, that these young Filipino guys would work hard, work dangerously, and then go home. And oftentimes that didn't really happen. They stayed here and became a bachelor society. But to combat this, they also had their own heroes. They had strong heroes that they were also wanted to make sure were supported. So they would rally around these Filipino boxers that initially were boxing came to the Philippines via the U.S. Army after the Philippine-American War. So those American soldiers taught them how to box, and they got into it. And so they had these world weight contenders and world weight champions here in the U.S. boxing at these different venues. And when they heard about their Filipino countrymen boxing, they would go and they would, gather to support them, going to the Olympic arena in Los Angeles, or the Hippodrome in, I don't know where that was, but I heard about it. So all these places were being attended by Filipino workers who, took time off to go and see their heroes fight and have something to be proud of. At the same time, they were assimilating to American culture and arts. So it wasn't just a question of like, well, we have our own arts and culture to bring here to the U.S. They wanted to be Americans. They wanted to live the American life. They wanted to live the American dream. One of the big things that hit them when they started being a colony of the U.S. was movies, and they watched movies all the time. So movies were very popular. So Hollywood was always kind of on their mind. Here's a picture of a friend of ours, Karina Montoya. Montoya did a book on Filipinos in Hollywood. She also did another book on historic Filipino town, tracing the roots of it. So here you see, I think these guys were auditioning for Munchkins in Wizard of Oz, but I'm not sure. Also, again, back to the music, during the war, there was also the 1st and 2nd Filipino infantry regiments of the U.S. Army. They were not a segregated group. They were actually a unit that was formed, but because of who was in it, a lot of people requested to be transferred to it or be part of it. It grew in strength so much that after they had the 1st regiment, they had to expand it to a 2nd regiment. These became the forefront of MacArthur's push back into the Philippines when they infiltrated into the country as spies and gave radio information of troop movements and ship movements to the U.S. as the U.S. was preparing to take back the Philippines. I shall return, as MacArthur said. So speaking of movies, so in the cast of Back to Bataan, this woman who was 17 years old at the time, Tawa DeCiccio, I had the pleasure of interviewing her and finding out that her kids went to high school with me at Banning High School, but I didn't know them that well then. Anyway, she earned the nickname of Jitterbug uh, from the set of the movie because uh, I guess she could really dance. And so this is another aspect of American culture that, we kind of think about. It's not the tinikling, it's, uh, jitterbug dancing, where they throw them in the air and they swing them between your feet and all that stuff. And so she became quite well known for that. Although when she admitted that on a oral interview I did with her on video, her kids were amazed. It's, Mom, we didn't know you could dance. So anyway, but this is from the set of that. So back to Bataan. If you see her, she's one of the kids in the schoolroom when they're having a schoolroom scene. She's one of the kids sitting there. She actually got the job by accident because she was asked to bring some kids to Hollywood to audition. And so she had a car and she was on her way to LACC to go to college. And so when she dropped them off, they decided to pick her instead of the other kids to be in the movie. So she lucked out. So she was in there. I don't know how much she got paid, but she's a very interesting person. So you may have heard of Macintosh suits. I didn't know what they were before, so I looked into it, and it turns out the Macintosh clothing company was the company that was responsible for making the clothes for all the Hollywood executives and the movie stars. So that's why Filipinos wanted to emulate this. They wanted to show off themselves as, very stylish, as very, you know, unforgettable. And so they paid a lot of money for these Macintosh suits, and so they would dress like the movie stars because those were that was the standard for them. They couldn't be just dressed in their work clothes all the time. So on weekends when they were off, they'd go into town, get a haircut, come back to the bunkhouse, grab a suit out of the closet, and it may not have been their suit, but they kind of collectivized all this stuff. Yeah, that was my grandma in the other shot. Well, I'll go back. So that's my grandma. It's her picture when they were hanging out in Long Beach with other relatives and other farm workers. My grandfather and my grandmother both came here in the early uh, in the 20s and early 30s, and they were different because he was able to bring over his wife, my grandmother, and they were contract laborers. So in other words, they would bring other Filipinos out to jobs, get them jobs. Hopefully not the way that Carlos and his friends were treated by other labor contractors, but they were in San Fernando, and I remember listening when we had the audiobook about Carlos going to lemon grove or orchard in San Fernando. And so I understand that my grandparents worked in San Fernando and brought workers out there to San Fernando to work. And I wonder if they crossed paths. But it turns out that my mother was born in San Fernando as an American citizen because she was born here in the U.S. And then my uncle also was born in Stockton when they moved up to Stockton. So we have a very close tie to the events that we're trying to portray here. So you notice these suits, they all look slick. And what would happen, my understanding is that they would have tailors or guys that would go out to the camps and measure them for their suit and order it. And then they would be custom made because, the stature of Filipino men isn't like a regular 46 or a regular 40 suit. They'd have to make sure that, because they were usually shorter than other guys, but they may have been stockier because of their muscles, that they had to, get these suits tailored for them, and that's why they look so slick. So they also did things like share cars to go on dates with. So they would, you know, put their money together and have a collective car that they would do. Also, in those days, if you were like a domestic worker, like my dad and his friends and my other relatives, they would share a room together, which is what we also learned in the story about them, maybe 6 guys to a room, and they would share everything. And that's how they could make ends meet because they weren't paid that much, or they would end up spending it at the taxi dance hall or gambling because of the constraints that they were in and the kind of mental isolation that they felt and loneliness. So their works in the past of literature and of music and so forth has come about to inspire a new generation of actors, performers, singers, musicians. In this particular show, a short story by Carlos Bulusan was converted into a play with music. Music, well, it wasn't a musical per se, but if you look online and YouTube, you can find snips of what has been performed on The Romance of Magna Rubio, about a farm worker who has corresponded with a white woman in Arkansas, and he wants to marry her, and she wants to marry him, and so she comes to visit him, and things happen. So you'll have to take a look at the clips to understand what happens in the story. But it was a wonderful experience to see it here locally done in LA. So it's also an inspiration for a lot of hip hop these days. The inspiration of culture, a culture that's not just about being able to sing like Lia Salonga in musicals and so forth, but also to have a political impact. So Balatasan is one of the ways that they tried to, Lonnie Carter tried to incorporate in rhyming in The Romance of Magna Rubio, where it is a kind of like a rapping uh, spoken word challenge back and forth, kind of like a rap war in a sense. And then how that shows itself today, we have groups, Native Guns, that used to be really a big deal, Blue Scholars in Seattle, and the new rapping sensation in the community is Ruby Ibarra out of the Bay Area. And so you may have seen her video at the tail end of the PBS special on Asian Americans. So other ways that popular culture has followed the way of trying to increase the arts and culture is in 2000 there was a film called The Debut. And in my opinion, it's probably the best film that shows the real life of Filipino Americans. And I show it every semester in my class. And oftentimes try to get some of the actors and actresses that have gone to other things to zoom in. And we were able to get a few of them last semester while we were in COVID Zoom classes. Another film that followed in the next year after that was The Flip Side, and that was a film done by Rod Pulido out of Cerritos, and it's more of a comedy, but it still is probably the first and only Filipino-American film to be debuted at the Sundance Film Festival. So it was a big deal for the community to have that. Today, folks are still working to produce more stories that tell other Americans who we are in the same way that Carlos was trying to do with his Americas in the Heart and poetry. This center picture is a boy band called the Rockefellers. They were all born out of country, but they settled in Carson as a family. And they had a one-hit wonder called Killer Joe, and did one album, and they've but they were on tour all over the place. They appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show on TV. They appeared on the Diana Shore Show. They appeared on the Jack Benny Show. And you can see some of their performances on YouTube. If you look up Rockefellers, it's pretty entertaining stuff. And I still know these guys. I played with a couple of them in a band before. This is Tony. He's passed away. I played with him. This is Eddie, the youngest guy. He performed with Don Ho in Hawaii as his bass player. This is Albert. Albert was with the Society of Seven for a number of years. And then their dad, another Doroteo, passed away. Tony passed away. And this is June. He's the only one still staying at the house that they have in Carson, along with his family. So they're still around, they're still gigging and performing, but another example of how you could say Filipinos have talent. And the roots of our culture is also being revived in terms of FPAC. So if you're not familiar, FPAC stands for the Festival of Philippine Arts and Culture. It was an annual occurrence down in San Pedro for a number of years and then moved up into LA. There is talks of trying to bring it back again as a drive-by in October this year. That's what I've heard. That's the latest I've heard. And so if you look online and look for FilAm Arts, FILAM Arts, ARTS.org, you'll be able to find the website of the group. I used to be on their board as a nonprofit organization, and it's hard during these times to get people together. But that's another reaching back to bring back Philippine culture and integrate it more into our showcase of what we are here in America. We have lots of writers now, fiction as well as biographies. And so this is some sample of that. And later on, I think we may hear this tune, but this is a poem by Philip Vera Cruz called Prophets Enslaved the World. And Philip Vera Cruz was one of the vice presidents of the United Farm Workers Union after the farm workers went on strike, started by Filipinos, and then joined by the Mexicans and Cesar Chavez with the prodding of Larry Itliong to get them to join up and take a stand against the growers during the Great Delano Grape Strike. So just remember that Filipinos started that strike, and Philip Vera Cruz was one of those Manongs who was a leader in the United Farm Workers, as well as Larry Itliong. To train new writers, and Carol was part of this too, there was a NDM Gonzalez, another well-known Philippine writer, workshop that was held annually at UC Santa Barbara. And this information I had, because I had some pictures, but I couldn't find them, of the group that was there that particular weekend up in the week in Santa Barbara. It was led by Peter Bacho, who's another writer from up in the Seattle area. He's written a number of books on the Filipino-American experience as well. This was a kind of conference, seminar, I guess you could say, that was held in the International Hotel in San Francisco back in 2015. It was at the same time that was being held as the PALA, the Asian Pacific American Librarians Association conference up at USF, University of San Francisco. So it coincided very well.
Right, I'm giving you a time check.
Okay, well, this is the last slide.
Wrap it up.
So this is the last slide, but there is a video that goes with this. So that's going to probably run into overtime. So Makibaka Wag Batakot, I had to check my spelling on that because I didn't spell it right the first time. This is a slogan we would yell at our demonstrations against the Marcos dictatorship: dare to struggle, dare to win. And this is A Time to Rise, a book that the Union of Democratic Filipinos, the KDP, has put out on our experiences on the front lines of fighting against the Marcos dictatorship and working for social justice for our community here in the United States, including housing for elderly, as well as other things. I guess I'm not going to show the video, but there's a link
No.
there, so you can watch the video later on your own. Thank you very much.